All right, Daniel, you're back again.
3 episode hot streak.
So, what are we talking about for your third episode in a row?
Whether you should contribute to your 401k or IRA after you've received the match, if and when it makes sense to buy whole life insurance, and how foreign financial assets fit into a plan.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, so now we're talking my kind of questions here. These are good, applied, practical things, right? Everybody has a 401k with a match. Everybody has a potential insurable need, and of course, everybody has a foreign yacht and villa that they need to plan around.
Of course, these are important planning topics to consider. So I did want to start with the first thing I mentioned, which is the 401k or IRA after a match. So like a lot of 401ks provide a match, and it's lovely and a wonderful benefit for employees to take advantage of. It's considered quote unquote free money, and it's very wise to take advantage of it and not leave it on the table. But after you've taken advantage of the match, let's say you have a couple $1,000s you'd like to save. Does it make more sense to put that into the same 401k when I don't receive a match, or into my IRA?
I think that's largely going to depend on the quality of the 401k. So a couple of things go into quality. Number one, fund selection or investment options that are available. Number two, plan costs. And then just number three, sort of ease of doing business.
Okay, so let's start with the investment options. What should someone look for to make an educated decision on if the investment options are worth contributing to?
So for context, 401k, generally speaking, has to have at least three investment options, kind of a growth option, a more conservative option, and a stable option. That said, many plans will offer something like 10 to 20 fund options that may or may not include a target date fund series. And I think really the easiest way you can just go through to check on the quality of your fund lineup, number one, is just look at the expenses. Not all 401ks are made equal. I've seen 401ks where the fund expenses or the investment product expenses are essentially 0.01 to 0.03 across the board. You see these in really big institutional companies like Apple or Amazon or Microsoft, where they have enormous economies of scale for their 401k plan. And so they've negotiated really, really good pricing with the various fund companies that they're utilizing within their plan. On the other hand, you often will see plans with expense ratios that are in the 30, 40s, and 50s. I think that kind of gets us to a middle or lower grade. And there are some plans out there, particularly in small businesses or small companies, where the fund expenses can exceed 1%, at which point that's pretty much a complete non-starter as far as the quality of the plan goes in terms of its fund lineup. And that's just using the filter of cost. That's a fast way to just determine, hey, are the investments even worth investing in? Beyond that, I think then you have to have accessibility to sort of a gradient of popular investment index options. So a large cap index, a small cap index, a mid cap index, maybe a growth or value version of those things if you like, a developed international index, a kind of developing markets or extended markets index to kind of get into some of the further corners of the earth. And then in the bond side, preferably, we will have access to both high yield bonds, corporate bonds, and treasuries. And ideally, in a perfect world, we'll have those in short, intermediate, and long duration. So that way we can adjust duration as needed.
And what's your take on self-directed aspects of 401ks if that's provided through the employer plan?
I think that gets into the element. Well, so sorry, let's actually define that for a second. When you say self-directed, are you talking about the availability of a brokerage window to a larger investment universe?
Yes.
Okay. So in that context, I am quite in favor of them if there's strong automation available through it. If it is a completely manual process, i.e. you have money taken out of your payroll, it goes into a money market sweep in the 401k, and you have to log in and manually transfer a balance over every pay period or every month or something like that, and manually place trades, I'm much less in favor of that, because any kind of marginal improvements you might get for quality of investments or reduced reduced costs or just kind of the scale of the catalog may very quickly be overwhelmed by the inefficiency, even if you're just missing your kind of reinvestment turnover period by a couple days or two, at a time. So I think there, in that particular instance, if you can allocate to a particular portfolio and automate it 100%, I think then having a brokerage window can be great if you know what you're doing, if you're a more sophisticated investor. But if it's a completely raw sort of trading platform, then I'm not so much of a fan.
That's fair. I don't think it's something we run into super frequently, but I do think it's interesting every time one of those plans does pop up. So stay with me for a moment here. Let's say the 401k has wonderful investment options, but the company doesn't provide a match. In that case, would you still contribute to the 401 or would it make really no difference?
There's a couple factors here. Because you have accessibility to a 401k, you've lost potentially your ability to make tax deductible pre-tax contributions to a traditional IRA, depending on your income level, your marital status, and so on. So that number one can be a big factor, particularly if you're higher income and you're looking for the tax deferral, even without the match. Even let's say if the costs in the plan are not ideal, if they're a little higher, just the ability to defer 23,000 or 30,000 plus compared to not being able to defer it can be a material factor there. Alternatively, if your income is low enough that you are in a lower tax bracket and you're thinking about doing Roth contributions, then I'm going to pretty heavily favor the Roth contributions over the 401k in those instances. But again, we've got to have some automation here. If this is once more a completely manual process where you have to log into your brokerage, once a month or every other week, and place a transfer and then wait a day for the money to show up, and then you have to reinvest it manually and so on. Again, I become less of a fan here because the human error factor could very easily overwhelm any possible efficiencies.
When you're making this decision, would you consider the vesting of the 401k at all?
Yes. Well, let me be cautious here because you've presented me with a scenario in which there is no matching schedule. So if there's no matching schedule, vesting is irrelevant because your contributions to a 401k are always yours. If we're going back to a situation where there is a match and there is a vesting schedule, then it really depends on my intended longevity in this company or the security of my position, because that is a factor to consider. Just because you get fired or laid off doesn't mean you suddenly accelerate your vesting. Generally speaking, you do have to actually fulfill the vesting requirements.
Great. Is there anything else people should know when making this decision?
I think the other thing to contemplate within this is just the practicality of building up multiple retirement plans over a lifetime. A piece of wisdom we give to financial planning clients quite often is that unless they've got like a truly awesome ex-employer 401k that's just incredible, we're usually going to recommend that people either roll their old retirement plans forward to their new employer or take it to an IRA rollover or a Roth IRA as appropriate, simply to avoid having the breadcrumbs left behind. So in terms of your original question about whether you should be contributing to an IRA once you get past the match, or if there's no match, should you just do an IRA in the first place? I'm inclined to lean towards yes there, simply because, in a perfect world, we wouldn't be so dependent on our employers and their retirement plans for our retirement security. But in turn, an employer or the vendors they've selected are third parties that you're not necessarily opting into. You're just sort of stuck with. And so some are easy to do business with. Thinking about companies like Fidelity, where they'll practically give anybody your retirement savings when you call them. They're incredibly easy to do rollovers from and so on. Whereas for other companies, a big problem that can arise with sort of commingling or keeping these older retirement plans in place can just be the factor of needing wet signatures from somebody in HR to do something like a rollover, which could be very difficult to do as time goes on.
I'm glad we brought this topic up because I think the default for a lot of people is just to put the excess savings into the 401 and not think about it. And if that is the easiest way to get people to save, by all means do it. But for the group of people who might say, well, I can optimize this a little bit more, or I can get this from A minus to an A plus, I think this is a really good opportunity to investigate for some folks.
I think it also gives you a little bit more of a conscientious awareness of what's going on with your investments and your savings. This is, however, also a domain where I do get into the competence factor, the education factor, the enthusiasm factor. I think the advice we've sort of covered so far is good for somebody who is enthusiastic, is somewhat educated, is engaged with their finances. If you are the type to forget you have a 401k, then this is not probably the right approach for you, simply because that automation is going to outweigh any possible benefit you could try to attain for yourself if you're not the type to really stay on top of it.
All right, Dan. So I've had this question on my mind for a while, been putting it off. Should I get whole life insurance?
You got kids?
No,
You married yet?
not yet.
Either of your parents dependent on you?
No,
I know you have a brother. Is he really leaning on you?
no.
Okay, then I'm not really hearing any particularly good insurable interests or people who need to be protected from a loss of your income based on your death that you need to protect. So why else is this on your mind? Because I think you're aware of all those factors already.
Well, I've been out of college for about a year and a half, and I have a bunch of friends in the finance industry, some of which work for some of these larger insurance institutions. And whether it's them or other agents or brokers that I interact with, there seems to be a pressing need for young individuals to invest in some sort of insurance that has an investment component. And it just seems to get brought up so frequently. And it sounds surprising that it's brought up so often for a group of people that it sounds like might not need it. So I wanted to talk about who this might actually be useful for, and if at all, if it's missold, why?
Okay. As we dive into this, let me clarify the parameters of your question here. Are you asking me really who should buy it, let's say at your age or close to your age, versus who shouldn't? Or would you like me to discuss more the issues with why it's being sold to people who may or may not need it so much, or both?
The latter slightly more than the former, but I would like to discuss both.
Okay. Let's give the benefit of the doubt first, because the former is the shorter part of this. Um, there are some people who graduate from college into phenomenal circumstances, or graduate high school into family businesses, or all sorts of circumstances that are sort of at the extremes, right? We're kind of talking about the ends of the distribution, two standard deviations away from the norm for most people, who, for whatever reason, actually might be in a position to need a permanent life insurance policy. Maybe they have a family history where a lot of them develop a level of something like diabetes or heart disease or cancer in their 30s or 40s. It's very common in the family. And so you're worried about an insurable interest where, even though you don't really have anybody who's depending on you, you're thinking, well, I might want to get married, or I might want to do something later in life. So I want to get this done while I'm still healthy so that it's in place. And in that particular case, you're doing it as a risk management decision, not as a wealth building decision. There are also people who have super duper high incomes early on in life for any variety of reasons. Think about professional athletes here, people who graduate from places like Harvard Law to big law firms on the Kravitz scale, where they're earning $215,000 their first year as a brand new attorney. So a couple of different kind of fringe scenarios where maybe you do just already have a situation where your income's high enough to be maxing out your 401k or maxing out a Roth IRA, or you're doing back to a Roth IRA contributions. You've got a really robust emergency fund. You've got a non-retirement brokerage account that you've already sort of done some funding with, and you're thinking, maybe now is a time to look at some options that provide me with a little bit of security, but still have some potential upside. I'll use myself as an example here. It's not a whole life policy; it's a universal life policy. But when I was 28, I purchased a variable universal life policy of myself in the amount of $1 million with an increasing death benefit to provide who was at my partner at the time, and who is now my wife, with an element of security in the event of my loss, but also to fund my future long-term care needs. So it comes with a rider to pay for long-term care. And the trick is the benefit for long-term care doesn't increase significantly over time, but what it is so sufficient today that even with 30, 40, 50, 60 years of inflation, it's likely to pay for several years of potential care needs at some point in the future. And so it's just solving two problems at the same time. The fact that it has an investment element is just a recognition that I was so young that the long-term investment return should be more than sufficient to accept the risk of the investment returns. Whereas with something like whole life, you have the general account and a mutual policy, or you have a fixed growth rate in certain whole life policies. And in those cases, it's a very, very conservative asset that may even yield a negative real rate of return in consideration of inflation. But at the end of the day, it's supposed to be a risk management tool.
I think that's a really good point you bring up, because the people who own or have these policies tend to think of them as investments. And that's typically because that's how they were sold the product. But like you mentioned, sometimes they actually have a negative rate of return, and they should be viewed as risk management tools first and foremost.
Well, and I think that is where we ultimately get ourselves into trouble as a profession, is when we are incentivized, and this is bridging over to your latter topic, but when we are incentivized to place insurance in instances where it is not the optimal tool for that purpose. So I'll preface this section. I am not going to be so broad as to say that if somebody works for an insurance company or life insurance company or mutual life insurance company, that they are always acting in bad faith or always making a bad recommendation when they sell somebody a permanent life policy. I know several great financial planners who work at some of these companies, thinking of Alan Robbins, Amy Agamata, who doesn't work there anymore, but has worked for one and has been a great member of the Financial Planning Association's Next Gen community. There are plenty of great, smart, hardworking people who really know their stuff who work at these companies. However, we have to think about the incentive structures. And herein we just sort of get into a classic Charlie Munger statement, right? Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. For many insurance-based companies, and I'll name a couple. I'm not trying to speak ill of them per se, but I'm just giving the examples here. So places like Northwestern Mutual, New York Life, Guardian Life, Mass Mutual, many of these companies, among many others, will hire people to be financial advisors or brokers or registered representatives, depending on kind of where they're coming in and so on. And they will tell them contractually, right, your job first and foremost is to sell X dollars of life insurance premium per year. And that amount may not be huge. Maybe it's $30,000, maybe it's $40,000. To give you some idea, $40,000 of life insurance premium might be selling something like $250,000 of whole life insurance to people between the ages of 60 and 70, 4 or 5 times a year. Not a huge number of policies. Or that might be selling 30 policies to people under the age of 30. For $500,000 a year. There's a whole set of economics here. But at the end of the day, these agents, these advisors, and so on who work for these companies are often contractually compelled to sell a certain amount of whole life or universal life or just the company's insurance products as a whole, in addition to perhaps doing financial planning, selling investment management, selling investment products, selling other insurance products or annuities, or even products from third parties. But at the end of the day, they have a contract. That contract says they are supposed to sell a certain amount of insurance premium. And when your contract says that, and therefore your livelihood depends on the fulfillment of those conditions, you are put under an undue level of pressure to sell those products and to sell those policies. And so that is where you sometimes run into a Maslow's hammer problem. Maslow's hammer simply being, for a carpenter whose only tool is a hammer, all problems look like nails.
When I was graduating from college, I was applying to a few different financial planning firms, and a firm that is an insurance company, a pretty large one, reached out to me, and I was fairly open-minded to see what they had to offer. They kept touting to me, how I'd be doing real financial planning and I wouldn't be part of the insurance team. Push comes to shove, they show me a contract and it says you have to write policies on 30 lives throughout the year to maintain your employment at this firm. And it's impossible when you're starting out in a career not to look at everybody, like you said, as a nail when you say, I need to write 30 lives this year. And, anyone you talk to, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, how or does this person need life insurance? And I think that's a very difficult frame of mind to put yourself in when you start your career. And it's probably not a very healthy place to be educated as well.
I think that is highly dependent, because a tricky thing can be here, to give an example, if you're brought in as sort of an independent agent, broker, advisor, whatever the title is, and that's the contract that's put in front of you, you're going to run into those incentive problems. And you might be surrounded by great mentors, But there's a joke about the Certified Financial Planner CFP professional acronym, which is that CFP stands for Can't Fucking Produce. And that acronym comes at sort of the expense of the people who say, I want to learn what I'm doing before I do it. To which sort of the old salts at a lot of these institutions will say, well, that's lovely, but if you can't sell enough policies or you can't get enough premium, it doesn't matter what you know because you're going to be out of a job. And in turn, there are people who go to work for some of these big institutions, not even just in the insurance world, but even in the wirehouse brokerage world, who instead of going to work as an independent agent or representative, they go and join a team and they don't sell anything. They may not even have the sales licenses, but they work as paraplanners, they work as admins, they work as support staff, and they really learn financial planning quite well from these people who have gotten to a point in their practice where they are sort of above the production requirements, or they have such a large book of business that they're meeting the production requirements by default. And in those particular instances, they can be great learning environments. So I think the real sort of heft and challenge here is for somebody who's looking at getting into the career field, you have to be very, very conscientious of the requirements of your position. Are you required to sell, whether it's a certain amount of revenue, a certain amount of fees, a certain amount of commissions, a certain number of products or policies, or an amount of premium? Then that is going to dictate everything you do every year until you hit that quota. And it's kind of amazing to see the difference in advice given by people from some of these institutions in, let's say, the spring of any year versus the fall of any year. You might see a substantially different set of recommendations because in the spring they've got a quota to meet, and by the fall they may have met it, and so their recommendations are no longer quite as twisted by that. Conversely, as you think about sort of where you get your insurance from or who you take your advice from, it's a really great question to just ask any financial advisor or financial planner from any firm, even if the only firm, hey, do you have production requirements or revenue requirements or sales requirements? Have you met them this year or this quarter or whatever the appropriate time period is? And does whatever you're recommending for me help you satisfy those requirements? Doesn't mean that there isn't a match made in heaven where what they recommend for you isn't what you need, and so on, right? At the end of the day, there's an opportunity here where some people need life or need insurance or whatever it is, and hey, we can work together and this is going to work out great. But I think it's very important to be conscientious of how substantial those incentives, or for that matter, those kind of requirements can be in terms of how that then affects the advice you were given.
I appreciate the feedback there. I think those are some really good points. A lot of these advisors, especially the more experienced ones, like you said, they don't really even think about the quota. It's something that they're hitting every year just by maintaining and working with their clients. And there are a lot of really great individuals and people who do work at these firms as well. So let's say someone had one of these policies, Dan, and they didn't, they're listening to this conversation and they're thinking, maybe I don't need this, or maybe I was sold this, probably prematurely. Do they have options to get out of it, or what is their best, plan of action moving forward?
Well, first and foremost, particularly for life insurance policies, kind of tying it back into our real focus here on the whole life piece, it's going to depend on how mature this policy is. If your policy is brand new, if you bought it, within let's say the past week, you might be able to just get out of it with what's called the free look period, where you can essentially say, "Oops, never mind. Give me my money back. I don't need this policy." If you're past that free look period and you're within the first couple of years, you essentially are just going to have to make a decision about whether you want to cut your losses here, because chances are, because of what we call surrender penalties, you are not getting any money back. Now, if you've had your policy for, let's say, 5 to 10 years, you may get a fraction of your money back or have the option to take some money out. And then that works for you. If you've had it for 10 plus, 15 plus years, you may be free of the surrender period, at which time, you may not get all of your money back, but you have been paying for insurance the whole time. So it's not like you haven't, gotten something from that. You have been protected during that time. And if you cancel your policy, you may get, a good chunk of your money back, or at least a healthy chunk of your money back, highly dependent on the structure of the policy. The alternatives can be to convert your policy to what's called a paid up policy, in which you essentially say, hey, I would like to stop contributing. please just give me the amount of life insurance for the rest of my life equivalent to what I have paid for up to this point, what my premiums and my cash value and my policy can pay for, but I don't want to pay anything else. In which point, maybe you put in $12,000, $13,000, and now maybe your policy converts to a $40,000, $50,000 life policy that's never going to lapse because it's fully funded, for the rest of your life based on what's already been paid into it. So you're not going to get your money back, but you're going to have life insurance for the rest of your life. Some alternatives, particularly for more mature policies, where let's say you bought a permanent policy in your 20s, now you're in your 50s or 60s, your kids are grown, you're retired or ready to retire, so you don't really have a life insurance need anymore. Potentially, you may need it for other reasons, but let's assume you don't have a particular need for it anymore. Other alternatives could be doing a 1035 exchange into a annuity or into a long-term care insurance policy, where we can convert the cash value in this life insurance policy into a stream of income, or we can convert it into an asset-based long-term care policy to pay for my care, potentially my spouse's care. So there's a number of potential ways that we can exit these policies, but it's really going to be highly facts and circumstances dependent. What I don't recommend is for anybody to just hear this podcast or read about something like this and go, oh, this is garbage, I don't need this, I'm canceling it right away. Talk to a professional, particularly a professional who's not incentivized to sell you a solution. So don't talk to the agent. Don't talk to just like another broker or another agent. Talk to a fee-only financial planner, even if it's just on an hourly or contract basis, and have them look at your policy, have them make some suggestions specific to your circumstances, and then decide if you want to take action. But don't just cancel your policy offhand just because you've heard us talk about it, because there can be some hard to undo or impossible to undo ramifications to just stopping paying your premiums or just outright surrendering your policy without considering the other options.
Last topic here, Dan. I wanted to talk about something we'd been discussing this week, actually, which is foreign assets and how they fit into a financial plan. You hear a lot of weird things about foreign financial assets. It's a way to evade taxes. You can get a higher rate of return in some of these underdeveloped markets. But I wanted to lay it all out there and really talk about this topic today. First and foremost, are foreign financial assets a way to shelter money from taxes?
I'm going to give you every lawyer's favorite answer. It depends. Generally speaking, probably not. And the reason I say that is because every country writes its tax code for itself, creates its retirement plans and accounts and policies for itself. And it's quite often the case that whatever type of asset you're buying overseas, the local tax laws in that country do not collaborate and coincide well with the tax laws of a country like the United States. And so while you might think, oh, I bought it overseas, now it's just sort of off the books as far as America is concerned, that is not how it works. And in fact, many people are in a very dangerous situation where they are presently not reporting things to the IRS that should be reported, and they are accruing some pretty massive penalties for failure to comply.
I think that is a pretty big misconception with families and individuals too, is that if you have a foreign financial asset but are a resident of the United States, that you don't have to report it. It's overseas, it's out there, and it's doing its own thing. But the penalties for not reporting foreign financial assets as a U.S. citizen are extremely steep. So for those people who do have foreign financial assets, are there additional considerations in terms of risk that they have to think about?
Taking it away from the tax compliance element and just thinking about these as investment assets, there's a number of additional risks. The easiest way to think about this is just from the scope of complexity. When I buy investments in the United States, from the United States, of the United States, on a U.S. securities exchange, in a U.S. regulated account, and so on, I'm pretty much living in sort of the sheltered box of the United States. And there's some external factors, but that is much more simple compared to owning an asset or owning investments or having foreign bank accounts or whatever it is overseas, particularly in countries that don't use the United States dollar, which is the vast majority of them. Most countries have their own currencies. And as well, accounting then for the regulatory, political, and geopolitical risks of that other country on its own in isolation, as well as in contrast to the United States. So, for example, a couple weeks ago, we had the yen carry trade as something some people were doing. People in the United States were borrowing money from the Bank of Japan, essentially at almost a 0% interest rate, if not a 0% interest rate, and then they were taking that money back to the United States and investing in assets, paying fixed yields of 4, 5, 6%, and pocketing the difference. And the moment that the Bank of Japan raised its interest rates by 1/4%, the yen suddenly spiked in value over 7%, which essentially erased the value of that trade because they had borrowed money in yen, they had to convert it to dollars, they had to make their investments in dollars, they then had to get a return on their investment in dollars, they had to convert it back into yen to pay it back. But if the yen gets 7% more expensive in a 1 year period, then your investment that is yielding less than 7% in a 1 year period, then your trade here is completely worthless. And that's just one particularly salient example, or recent example, of where international factors took what otherwise seemed like a sure thing and completely invalidated it.
So investing in international securities is a prudent part of diversification. But frankly, Dan, I don't feel like going overseas and opening a brokerage account. Are there other options available that I can still participate in international trade and profit without having to open an international account?
Sure. I mean, you have just the huge number of international investment products, Vanguard Total International Stock Market Index, Emerging Markets Index, MFS, or MSCI. International index products. You have plenty of securities-based products in the United States created by American companies to invest in foreign markets that do not expose you to as many of those risks in a direct sense. Now, the irony is on the back end, inside of the product, those risks are still there. You just don't have to deal with the complexity, right? You can just buy the mutual fund, buy the ETF, and kind of call it a day. If you want to invest in foreign companies, directly in their stock, you have what are called ADRs, American Depository Receipts, which are essentially proxies for foreign held stock. They just create a little bit of a simplification where you don't need to open an account on, let's say, like an Israeli stock exchange or a Chinese stock exchange or something. You can just buy it in the United States and have an equivalent here. So there's a number of ways to simplify that process for you. But I'll say for anybody listening, you are not going to make your fortune by plumbing the depths of the international stock market for individual companies. That is a very, very complex investment arena. Tons of investment professionals with huge amounts of experience, big research teams fail to do it very effectively all the time. And so I would urge a lot of caution. If you want to invest overseas in something like a second home or something like that, that's very complex, but that makes a little bit more practical sense for an individual. Whereas when it comes to just trying to, let's say, beat the market or be a day trader, looking at overseas assets adds enormous complexity very quickly. And it's something that the vast majority of investors are going to be ill-equipped to do successfully.
All right, last question here. What about for estates? Are foreign financial assets a way to hide assets from your estate potentially?
No, because in the United States, Uncle Sam says, "Render unto me all things." So, an interesting tidbit about sort of tax policy in the United States versus other parts of the world is that the United States utilizes a citizenship-based model of taxation, whereas most other countries utilize a residency-based model of taxation. So, if you're an American citizen, doesn't really matter where you live, doesn't matter where you make your money, doesn't matter if it's overseas and so on. The United States government has a general disposition to say, you have to pay us based on that income. There's one particular example I can think of a gal who was born from American parents, makes her an American citizen by default, but she was born in Australia, has lived in Australia her entire life, and every year gets the privilege of filing an American tax return, despite the fact that she's never been to the United States. So there's just kind of a point of reference here that ultimately, just because you put it overseas does not mean you get to avoid things. And to compound upon that, estate laws vary dramatically between countries. So tax policy can sometimes have a nice, clean sort of tax treaty. The US and the UK have a tax treaty, the US and Canada have a tax treaty, and so on, where there's a lot of sort of, we'll call it APIs between tax policy in different countries. But estate law can get really, really messy. Some countries don't recognize trusts. Other countries have, substantial estate taxes, others have none. And so just saying, I'm going to kind of dump my money overseas and that's going to kind of get it out of Uncle Sam's sight That could be the case depending on the type of asset and where it's placed and what the tax treaties are. But on the other side of that, you're now exposing yourself to substantial risk from estate law. And I'll say right now, as a financial planner, I am not equipped to help you answer that question on an individualized basis. I know very little about Canadian, Mexican, United Kingdom, French, German, Chinese, Japanese, etc. tax and estate law, nor do most accountants, nor do most attorneys. It's a very specialized area to understand the real nuances, the rules between the United States and any singular other country. So for that purpose, anybody who comes out and says, oh, you're from anywhere or you have assets anywhere, and I just definitely know how to help you with that, you should be pretty dubious of that. That's a very rare, very specialized skill set. It's very expensive in the places where people actually have it. So just be mindful at the end of the day that when you introduce foreign assets in a direct held sense, real estate, bank accounts, investment accounts, business ownership, whatever it is, you are adding to your complexity enormously. You're adding to your compliance costs enormously via the professionals you're going to have to engage to do it correctly. And your risk is very seldom going to be disproportionately outweighed by your potential returns from applying these types of strategies or utilizing these types of assets.
All right, so three main things I took away there. First and foremost, if you have directly held foreign financial assets, the tax penalties for not reporting them are pretty strict, and some of the estate rules and regulations can be tricky depending on the location of the held away asset. I'd say the second thing I learned here is for most individuals looking for some level of diversification out of the US market, they're probably better off simply investing in some sort of international ETF. And then I'd say third, seems like the US tax code is going to make sure that they get their money regardless of your assets being held in the US or overseas. And frankly, they don't care where it is because they want their money.
Uncle Sam always gets his share. All right. Well, Daniel, you've asked me sort of your three question topics here. So you know what I'm going to ask you. What is it that you have learned that's most interesting or beneficial in the past week?
We've had a couple meetings with folks either in retirement or close to retirement, and they love and crave certainty around their plan and their future. And I think I've also realized because of that, a lot of them tend to flock toward fixed income and cash alternative investments because they tend to believe that those are safe. They're not fluctuating and, more or less they're stable. And I think it brings us back to an interesting point we discussed last week, which is you can either, have all the uncomfortability and risk early in your life and then live the remainder of your life, kind of without the stress on the financials, or you could do the opposite where you invest in some sort of fixed income and it feels great today and it feels great tomorrow. But in 5-10 years, there's going to come a point where you realize you haven't been appreciating your assets enough to beat inflation. And I think for a lot of people, they have to ask themselves if they're okay with that or if they'd rather take the risk on earlier in their career so they can have a comfortable retirement and not have to worry about, outpacing the market later in life. And I just think that clarity and understanding their level of, certainty and what they want is important because it's going to help tailor their portfolio to what they can actually stomach.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.